And where we left off on Tuesday, basically, we were discussing sort of the presidential election of 1968, and so the split in the Democratic Party that sort of led to, for one of the reasons, Lyndon Johnson decided not to run again. He was concerned about his health, not actually living through another term. And he had some challengers that had sort of polled well and had started doing the primaries in 1968 early on. So he doesn't run, and Herbert Humphrey, his vice president, gets the nomination from the Democratic Party, but fails to win the election, and we get Richard Nixon. And Nixon was certainly qualified to be president. He had been a senator in the late 40s and early 50s before becoming vice president. He was the vice president for Dwight Eisenhower. We read something along, way back towards the beginning of the classes where Nixon had gotten into a little trouble, or there was some criticism about how he had spent some campaign funds. And that's going to be kind of, it's going to pale in comparison to what comes for him later. But he's very qualified. He had also been the challenger to John F. Kennedy. He had been the Republican nominee in 1961 to run against Kennedy. And briefly, before we kind of get into his presidency, one thing that was interesting about that particular race in 61 was there was the first televised presidential debate. And so a lot of people still listen to it on the radio. It was still, broadcast on the radio. It still is today, I think, like on NPR or something like that, or a news radio. And of course, it was televised. So you had a pretty good sized television audience by 1961 that was watching it. And just like they do today, there was polls after the debate, surveys that asked people, telephone surveys and things that asked people, how the two candidates did, who they think won the debate. And what was interesting, the people who listened to it on the radio felt that Nixon had won the debate, while more of the people that watched it on TV thought that Kennedy had won the debate. Now, listen to it on the radio, you simply just had to focus on the content, right? You were focusing on their policies, the arguments they're presenting within the debate. But on TV, you actually get to see Kennedy and Nixon. Now, Nixon, not much to look at. And he was a little sweaty, seemed kind of nervous, had a 5 o'clock shadow, where John Kennedy was very poised, as Kennedy's always seemed to be, and seemed very presidential. So it was an interesting time. And of course, from then on, you have these televised debates. So, having sort of a TV presence, or having that poise on television, really starting with Kennedy, became important to possibly your election. How you actually look. Do you look presidential? So at least on his second go around in the 1968 election, he wins. Some of that due to the fact that there's this division within the Democratic Party. There's sort of this finally tear away from that Southern segregationist that had mentality that had plagued the Democrat Party since the Civil War. Part of the reason they may have lost was because George Wallace, who I'd mentioned on Tuesday with his running mate Curtis LeMay, had won 4 or 5 states in the South. But either way, we get Nixon as president, and it's still, it's a troubling time in the late 60s. There's going to be things that plague his presidency. But there's also things that he accomplishes as well that shouldn't be short-sighted because of some other issues. So we'll start with his relationship with China and the Soviet Union. So we enter this period of détente with the Soviet Union and China. So détente is basically a relaxing of a relationship, easing of tensions between the U.S. and the Second World, right? The communist regimes in China and the Soviet Union. There was a lot of progress made. Nixon, excuse me, went to China. He visited Beijing. He talked to the leadership there. He met with Mao Zedong and other key officials in China. And then shortly after went to Moscow and visited the Soviet Union, and then had invited Leonid Brezhnev, who's in the picture. That's Brezhnev on the left and Nixon on the right. I'm not sure. That might be Henry Kissinger. I'm not sure who the figure is there in the middle, but Nixon on the right there. Brezhnev visiting the White House. He visits the U.S. And so there's, this sort of new relationship that's burgeoning there, and some hope of maybe, working together, and kind of easing the tensions that had in the Cold War. As a side note, completely unrelated to Nixon, I just wanted to point something out looking at this picture. So you may recall we had a president by the name of Barack Obama a little over a dozen years ago. And like most presidencies, but his in particular, was plagued with these conspiracy theories about whether he was loyal to the United States and where his loyalties lie and blah blah blah. And, was he actually a U.S. natural born citizen? All this crap. One of many of the conspiracy theories surrounding him was this idea that he had installed a Muslim prayer curtain in the White House. And there's this photo of him, behind this or standing in front of this supposed Muslim prayer curtain. Now, I'm not an expert on the religion of Islam, but as my understanding is, for starters, there is no such thing as a Muslim prayer curtain. Secondly, the supposed Muslim prayer curtain you'll see hanging behind Nixon and Brezhnev here in this photograph. So those particular curtains had been in the White House and have been up, installed and taken down several times, and were initially put in by Nixon. So I don't know, maybe Nixon was a secret Muslim radical fundamentalist, maybe, I don't know. But that's just reinforcing, be skeptical of what you read, see, and hear. Anyway, so moving on. So things are kind of improving there. And that helps him with the Vietnam War, because he had campaigned on getting the United States out of the Vietnam War through this idea, what he calls the Vietnamization of the war, which was modernizing the South Vietnamese army, giving them, sort of very modern weapons and technology to fight the North Vietnamese, getting them trained, and basically getting them to stand on their own without active fighting by the United States, supporting them, financially or militarily, with goods, but making them fight on their own. And we'll talk about that in a minute, how well that goes. There's still lots of bombing in the they're supporting the war as the United States starts to draw down and withdraw forces. There's still tons of bombing that's being performed by U.S. aircraft. But also you have the anti-war movement continuing, because we haven't yet to completely withdraw from the war. And there are, periods of violence within the anti-war movement and protests, riots across the country. And, often, again, as I mentioned before, the universities and colleges were a hotspot for this. Any type of movement, when you get young, passionate people together, that's, where you're going to have a lot of activity. And it was the right place and the right time for the anti-war movement. And then there was one particular episode at Kent State University here in Ohio that led to the death of 4 students. Nixon called out the National Guard in Ohio to sort of put down, some destructive rioting and protests at Kent State. And with some nervous young men in the National Guard, and not really having, when the dust settles, a real threat to their life or endangerment of them, opened fire on some students and wound up with four students getting killed, which is not a good look for a president. Was not a good look for the nation. It showed, particularly the fact that this was National Guard. So this is, military, in the midst of a anti-war protest, shooting at students. So a real black mark there on the presidency early on for Nixon. Another big issue, just a year or two after that, actually, I think it was about maybe 1973. This came a little bit later, was the release of what's known as the Pentagon Papers. So Daniel Ellsberg was an employee. He was an analyst at the Rand Corporation, Santa Monica, and he had access to top secret documents, as people that work at Rand do who have security clearance. I spent 2 summers at Rand working in Santa Monica, and my supervisor, of course, I didn't have any type of clearance, but even if I had to meet with my supervisor, he worked on this level in the building that was security clearance only. And he had to come meet me at the door when we had a meeting in his office and escort me to his office and then escort me out. So there's, some very sensitive documents that this place handles because they do military policy. Well, Ellsberg found some documents, or was looking at some documents, and realized that the United States had been doing this secret bombing in Cambodia and Laos, that we were basically fighting a secret war, not just in Vietnam, but in Cambodia and Laos. So he starts turning these papers over. He puts them in his briefcase and takes them home, copies them, and hands over a bunch of these documents to the New York Times, who begins publishing them. So again, looking really bad on the war effort, that we are, basically doing this fighting outside of what was known to Americans. And, not just that, that was really what was upsetting. Probably not so much that we were fighting in Cambodia and Laos, but the fact that we were, that the United States had been covering that up and had hidden that from the American people. So once again, another issue for the Nixon administration. So the U.S. finally basically pulls out most of its fighting troops by 1973. There's still some advisors there, some military personnel, but there's no more active fighting outside of some aerial support, in bombing, things like that. But there's no more troops on the ground fighting in 1973, leaving the South Vietnamese to stand on their own. You may remember, I've mentioned along the way, that there was problems with leadership all through, going back to the 1950s, but through the 60s with the leadership in South Vietnam. And perhaps their willingness to continue fighting and maintain a independent South Vietnam. So eventually, this South Vietnam government falls to North Vietnam. And basically what's seen as the end is the fall of Saigon. So your capital in the South was Saigon. The capital in the North was Hanoi, which is now, I think, renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Or maybe Saigon was renamed. one of the two was renamed. But anyway, that was, once you've taken the capital, just sort of like the Red Army in World War II surrounding Berlin. That's really, quite the signal that this is likely over. And there's a lot of images from that time, tanks rolling into the embassy, the U.S. embassy, and the Saigon capital, and the last helicopter out of Saigon is sort of a famous image, removing the last the last few diplomats and Americans that were working there, along with some South Vietnamese and other South Vietnamese that were trying to get on board these aircraft because they were worried about becoming political prisoners and things like that. So, but we'll kind of get back to that in a minute because that's a little bit down the road. We have a few other things to deal with, but there's also some successes and some things that we don't often consider being part of a conservative or a Republican agenda that is established during Nixon's presidency. For one, the Environmental Protection Agency has started, the EPA. So we are now looking at regulating, the pollution output of corporations, monitoring water quality and things like that, which is done by the EPA. So that's under Nixon. And we also have the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. So, looking at workplace safety. So, if you ever have a job, in a kitchen or a warehouse or any place like that, a lot of times you'll see some posters sponsored by OSHA, about workplace safety. And what to do, like if there's some type of code violation or something, you contact OSHA. If there's a broken rail and there's concern somebody might fall or something like that, OSHA is the people that you contact for that. So, really an important organization when it comes to sort of labor law and labor issues. But then we get to the big problem with the Nixon administration. Let me take a drink of water so we can dive into Watergate. So we're probably all familiar with this term. It's become what's known as a metonym. So, we know homonyms are words that sound alike but have different meaning. Synonyms are words that have a similar meaning. A metonym is a word that starts to become that begins to have a new meaning, and it's been used over and over again. So now, whenever there is a scandal, we attach the word "gate" to it, which kind of started with there was an issue in the Clinton administration with this investment group or something. It was called Whitewater, and critics of Clinton and everything started calling it Watergate. But now, anytime there's like a scandal or something, you'll hear people attach "gate" to it, and that comes from the Watergate Scandal. And Watergate it still is, just this building complex in the Soggy Bottom district of Washington, D.C. There's apartments, there's a hotel, and there's office space. That's all Watergate is. But what's important about this place is that it was the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. They had office space that they rented from the Watergate office building. Well, there was a lot of discussion among some higher officials in the Republican Party about some nefarious activities, some shady tactics to use against the Democrats in the 1972 election. And honestly, right now, I don't even remember. Was that McGovern that ran against? Give me a second. It's so clouded by the Watergate scandal that I don't remember who the nominee for the Democrats. Yeah, it was George McGovern. So McGovern, who we had spoke about earlier, who had been a bit of a potential candidate in 1968, gets the nomination in 1972. But so they're talking about all this sort of shady activity that they're going to use against the Democrats for Nixon's reelection. And there is a break-in performed by some of these people looking for campaign documents, photocopying, photographing campaign documents, and wiretapping phones. They tried to install recording devices in the offices there, trying to gain information in secret about the Democratic campaign for McGovern. Well, these gentlemen are arrested. There's 5 arrests made after this break-in, and they quickly find a connection to campaign funds. It's I forget the organization or the office. It's like the campaign to re-elect Richard Nixon or something like that. But so there's a tie-in here that is starting to connect some high officials and maybe Nixon himself to this break-in at the Watergate office, the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Well, this is going to go on for like 2 years, right? We're talking about 1972 when he's actually elected, so he's elected in November, takes office in 73, and this goes on for another year after that. And so once it comes to light that this may go deeper than just 5 schmucks breaking into this office for whatever reason, there's a congressional investigation that started, and they want to access recordings from the Oval Office. Well, basically, even today, most of those recordings, most phone conversations are recorded, and depending on the president, a lot of in-person conversations are recorded. Well, here's the first issue. Nixon's administration, Nixon, is refusing to turn over those recordings. And this is basically a constitutional crisis. There cite things like executive privilege, which basically the president is not following the rule of law at this point, which is a real concern. Well, finally, they start turning over tapes, and it's a confirmation that while Nixon may not have been involved or orchestrated the break-in, he was part of the cover-up and trying to prevent any trace to him and trying to cover this up. And some of the tactics they were using there were really shady. So using federal offices like the FBI to silence people, not like permanently, but try to push down and suppress information from coming out. One other way that this came to light was because of journalist investigation. So Woodward and Bernstein was this journalism partnership, 2 guys that worked for the Washington Post, and they had an inside source that was feeding them information. So very early on after the break-in, they started covering this Watergate scandal and routinely met with this unnamed source. Only like in the 2000s, I think, like 30 years later, did Woodward actually name his source, and it was like the deputy director of the FBI. It was a high-ranking like FBI official that was giving him this information. So things are getting, pretty bad for Nixon at this point. And Congress starts preparing for impeachment proceedings. But then Nixon resigns in August of 1974. To date, he is the only president to resign from office. So to avoid that impeachment, and to basically avoid and possibly incriminating himself, he resigns. So then we have Gerald Ford, who becomes president, succeeds Nixon. So this is what Nixon takes office in 73. Ford takes over for him in August of 74. Almost immediately pardons Nixon, and which prevents him from being indicted on any possible criminal charges. So he's free and clear. That doesn't really set well with a lot of people, and is going to, possibly hurt his reelection. But even early on, Ford isn't sure that he wants to run for reelection in 76. He's finally sort of talked into it, but by that time, things aren't going really well in the United States. For one, he's seen as being associated with this scandal. Then under his watch, not under Nixon, but under his watch, is the actual failure in Vietnam. So the fall of Saigon and the totality of Vietnam being unified under the communist North Vietnam happens under him. He has a challenger, this dude named Ronald Reagan, who's the governor of California at the time. Excuse me, a former Reagan, of course, a former actor, had been a Democrat early on, a lot of his time in Hollywood, but then becomes a Republican, is very, very, very anti-communist, and is a critic of Ford as possibly the reason that we failed in Vietnam. So he has a challenger there, but he does get the nomination. But there's other things culturally that affect Ford. Ford in 74, before maybe a few months before Nixon resigns, but when all this is kind of heating up, Ford is playing golf, and he tees off and hits a spectator in the head with his golf ball. The guy was okay. I mean, it didn't injure him or anything, but maybe put a bruise on his head. And then like a year later or so, he's getting off of Air Force One. He's coming down the steps and he falls. Right now, presidents, they're on TV. Anytime they're in the public, they're getting recorded. They're getting photoed. They're getting videoed. And they're human. So things like that happens. We got, Joe Biden is a perfect example of that. We've seen him fall upstairs. We've seen him fall off his bike, all this going on. Unfortunately for Ford, this kind of image of him sort of dovetails with a new television program called Saturday Night Live that starts in 1975. And which is now, of course, well known for taking shots at political figures. No president has dodged a treatment from the cast of SNL. Well, here we have early on, Ford being portrayed by Chevy Chase. And it is basically, that is the shtick there. That is the running joke. So Chevy Chase shows up on SNL, the cold open or at some point during the show, and at some point he's going to fall. That's the joke. And just like the picture I have there, that's Chevy Chase on SNL. Chevy Chase wound up with a long time painkiller addiction after being injured several times for taking some of these pratfalls as Ford, and then later on in his career where he kind of got known for that kind of thing. But he's starting to be portrayed as a sort of bumbling idiot in the media, and that doesn't help him at all either. For his benefit of the doubt with Ford, I mean, he had been an athlete, he had been a football player, he was in the military, but when the media kind of grabs something like that and runs with it, it's going to affect the public perception of him. But that makes room for a challenger like Jimmy Carter. And Carter will be the next president after Ford. So Carter was he's kind of new to politics. He had been a state senator in Georgia, and then becomes the governor, and is the sitting governor as he's running for the presidency. But he's going to inherit a lot of issues, and just generally speaking, a bad time in the United States. So one of the issues here that's going to be right on the heels of his or occurring right before his presidency is there's two economic recessions. So there's an economic downturn after quite an economic expansion in the 60s. There are two energy crises that are part of these recessions, particularly the one in 1973, and then again in 1979. So, he did see some economic growth in his presidency. He did early on, when he took office, see some successes. But again, there's two energy crises, one during Nixon's presidency, and then in 1979 under Carter, where there is actual fuel shortages, both of which are one of the issues causing the shortages are crisis in the Middle East. In 1973, it's the Yom Kippur War between Israel and Egypt that causes some issues with oil delivery and slowdown and some embargoes. In 1979, it's the Iranian Revolution, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But in both cases, there was a quite short supply. And we also read something about the energy crisis from Carter earlier on, which is why I want to kind of discuss him as well. And he, was really coming down on the idea that we need to find new energy sources. He, as president, installed water heating solar panels on the White House. And used a wood stove inside the White House to limit the amount that he was using. Carter, in a lot of ways, even as a Democrat and as a liberal, was more conservative than a lot of Republicans. Like, he really wanted to conserve. He was very fiscally conservative and looking at ways that to reduce our energy usage. So yeah, in 79, for instance, there's widespread shortages that are causing huge lines at the gas pumps. So like mile-long lines, people waiting to get to the pump and hoping to get gas. Now, you might remember when prices started going up here, people started to panic and they were filling up every gas can and everything they could find, to make sure they got cheap gas. We never really had a supply shortage, though. You never went to the pumps and were like, no, we don't have gas today. That was an issue in 1979. That's why he was very concerned about, the possibility of us just flat out running out of gas within the next decade or so. I mean, that's still an issue. It's still going to happen at some point. That is a finite resource. But the reality then was like, man, we might be in trouble here. This might not last, for another decade or two. And of course, along with that, the price per barrel shoots up to double, which is part of some of the inflation issues that are happening in the 1970s, the late 1970s. So let me take another drink of water so I can get into this. You've probably heard a few things about inflation here recently. And if you watch the news, if you hear anything about the news, they'll say, this is the worst inflation we've seen in 40 years. Well, that inflation that they're talking about is from the Carter administration. Last year, I think the rate of inflation was something around 5%. Not good. Not horrible, not good. I think around this year, we're looking at about 9% or something like that. It's hard to say in the middle of the year. It's usually, that's an economic figure that's, analyzed and calculated at the end. In 1979, inflation was 11.3%. And in 1980, it was 3.5%. So when they say the worst inflation in 40 years, it was, still not nearly as bad as what was seen in 1979, 1980. Same with the gas prices. Relative to today, with inflation and whatnot, what people were paying at the pumps, even if it was whatever the amount was way worse economically to them than what we pay today, as bad as things have been. And of course, it has started to come back down here recently. So economically, they're struggling. Part of that was because they were kind of coming out of a recession, but interest rates are going up, and you have prices that are going up. So people are concerned. Employment had come down a little bit after that 1975 recession, but you have some employment issues. And of course, there's other sort of panics and things that are affecting American morale. One of which is this near disaster at 3 Mile Island, which is a nuclear reactor facility, a nuclear energy that has a near meltdown. So, literally what happens is a reactor overheats. They're unable to cool the reactor. Something happens, whatever, mechanical failure, and the fissile material, right, the radioactive material, literally melts down into the ground and contaminates everything within, however many miles, however severe it is. The Chernobyl incident that happens in the 1980s in the Ukraine is the worst known. Well, yeah, it's still the worst known meltdown and sort of nuclear accident to date. The Fukushima reactors after the what was that? The earthquake in Japan. That was a huge issue, but still not as bad as Chernobyl. This was not anywhere near that, but it causes quite a panic. When it hits the news. And then we have the Iranian Revolution that started in January 1978 and more or less is completed in 1979, which is the overthrow of the Shah of Iran. The Shah had been in power, I think, since the 1953, somewhere right around there. It was in the 1950s. He is a pro-Western ruler, meaning that he's, he sides with the United States. United States is buddies with him. But he is also a very authoritarian monarch. So there are lots of problems in Iran as far as the way he rules. Nevertheless, things weren't real bad in Iran economically. There had been some economic progress. it would have been fairly calm, although the Ayatollah Khomeini had been a political rival, had attempted a revolution in the 60s, and had been imprisoned. But so it kind of hit people by surprise when all of a sudden there was this revolution. The Shah comes to the United States to seek some medical treatment, and is basically in exile through most of that revolution. So what we have is a replacement of this authoritarian monarchy with a theocracy. The Ayatollah is basically the leader of Iran. And there is, sort of like a parliamentary government, this and that, but it is more or less a theocracy that's basically installed by the beginning of 1979. Part of the issue here with that is there are hostages, U.S. hostages. There are 52 U.S. hostages that are kidnapped or held prisoner that were basically diplomats. They worked for the State Department. They were working in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran when this revolution starts. So they're being held, and there is an attempt in April 1980 to rescue them. And it's called Operation Eagle Claw, and it is a huge disaster for the military. I won't get into a lot of details, but they were trying to they had this sort of like meeting point in the desert. There were these two C-130 cargo aircraft that were serving as tankers, right? They were carrying fuel. And there was a bunch of helicopters. There's supposed to be, I think, 8 or 9 helicopters, and there were some mechanical issues. So only like 6 of them showed up at this site. And when it was all said and done, they looked like they're going to have to cancel and abort the mission because of weather and mechanical issues with the helicopters and stuff like that. Well, they were sitting there and idling, and they were burning fuel. And of course, they had these tankers there. So one of the helicopters was trying to move into position to refuel from one of the aircraft. And the rotor hits the tail of the aircraft and spins around and crashes into the side of the aircraft, into the side of the C-130. And there's this huge fireball because it was full of, fuel. And there's several members of the Air Force and I think a few Marines that were killed in the explosion, and it was just another huge black mark, not just for Carter but for the military, who had been seen as defeated by North Vietnam. Basically, the military is suffering right now because of this image problem. Some of that has to do with things that had happened during the Vietnam War. We talked briefly about the My Lai massacre and things like that, and just this general sense of failure within the military because of the loss of Vietnam. And then Operation Eagle Claw was like another big smack in the face for them. So their image is suffering across the board, whether it's the Navy, Air Force, Army, doesn't matter. They're all kind of suffering. They're all volunteer force now, so even recruiting is difficult. And you have all of these sort of issues that are occurring in the late 1970s. Carter was a bit of a realist. He was honest with the American people, which may have hurt his reelection attempt. And he's also known for, and I might talk about this a little bit on Monday, and just to kind of wrap up here, he's known for this speech called the Crisis of Confidence speech. And he basically got on TV and, told Americans, it's like, look, things might be kind of hard for us, for the next year or so, or for this amount of time. And it's going to be up to all of us to sort of see it through. We're all going to have to tighten our belts a little bit. We might have to, stop spending as much as we're spending and do what we can to, get through this hard time. And initially, right after his speech, his numbers went up. His polling numbers went up, and things seemed okay. But his rival, Ronald Reagan, who's going to be the presidential candidate for the Republican Party eventually, kind of seizes on that message and changes sort of the idea and starts promoting the speech as the American malaise speech, that he was basically, Carter was sort of preaching to the American citizen about their sort of lack of will. And, that's what malaise sort of, not necessarily laziness, but sort of being sort of glazed over and just sort of going through our daily lives. But that was not obviously in the intent of Carter's speech. And again, sort of just being honest and real with the American people about, that we're kind of in hard times. We heard that when he talked about the energy crisis, that, hey, this is a real issue. And that's the way he tended to address the American people. But most people, and Americans particularly, don't like to hear about hard times and bad times coming. So it didn't work well for him in the end. And the last thing here, just to say about Carter, even though his presidency was really wrought with issues, and a lot of that, not necessarily his fault. When it's all said and done, Carter might be one of the best human beings this planet has ever seen, just as far as a good person. After his presidency, he went on to, I think he actually created Habitat for Humanity, where he builds houses for the underprivileged. And when I say builds, he's not just like the talking head behind the organization or the strategist. Even into his 90s, and this man is still alive, it will be seen working with his tool belt, helping to build houses. And he won a Nobel Prize for his work in the early 2000s. So that gets us into the 1980s. So we'll start with Reagan on Monday, but in the meantime, first off, let me ask, is there any questions about the 70s, about Ford, Watergate, Nixon, or anything else? A couple things I want to go over before I let you guys take a break. Okay, we're good there. We just want to cover a couple things that are coming up. So I think what I want to do is wrap up on Monday with the Cold War, or just basically we'll end with the Cold War at the end of the 1980s, and then we'll start talking about a few different things that we need to cover to get you ready for the social studies test. So first off, we'll finish Monday with history, most likely. If there's anything left, maybe Tuesday. There's two things that I think we need to sort of dive into that's not covered well with Essential Ed, and that's maps and timelines. So I want to start focusing on those. With maps, I mentioned I wanted to do some more civics and government, so I can kind of incorporate that with talking about maps. So next week, we're going to focus on finishing up history, talking a little bit about civics, and making sure that we understand maps and timelines, okay? Then the week after, we're going to start hitting up some practice tests. So we're just going to have a battery of practice tests so you guys can start seeing, what the questions are going to look like on a test, and, get an opportunity to answer, some various questions. So honestly, in the next 2 weeks, I want to have you guys ready to start taking your practice test, right? So I will start at that time letting Tracy Johnson know that you guys are going to be ready for your test. So any questions about that? All right. So
you mean after 2 weeks is social study practice test, only social study?
Well, you could go at your own pace. I know, Debbie, you had, kind of came in late to the class. That was something else that I want to suggest. So for any of you guys that you might still have essential ed lessons to finish, over the next 2 weeks, that would be a good time to finish them. And then obviously, so, at the end of that 2 weeks, I'll get back to you guys. We could talk individually. It's like, how ready do you feel? Do you want some other, review and things like that? I'm just kind of outlaying sort of a timeline as far as the way I'm looking at it to get you guys ready. Does that make sense?
Okay, it's only for social studies for every subject.
Just social studies. Yeah, that's something else. I know you're fairly new.
Oh, okay.
I've mentioned this before. Social studies is usually the first class that we finish with. There's not quite as much information. There's not as many lessons.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the good side there is that you may be able to go ahead and knock that out of the way and not have to worry about it, right? You don't have to take all of your GED exam at one time. You can take one part at a time. And of course, usually after that, it's science. Rachel usually finishes science not too far behind social studies. So yeah, you can kind of focus on one at a time and kind of get it out of the way. Any other questions?
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, so you
No.
saying if we in the next 2 weeks we take the practice test, say we do good on the practice test, we could go ahead and take but we would have to pay for it on our own though, right?
No. If once I tell Tracy that you guys are ready for the practice test, you will get your practice test paid for. Okay. And then if 145 is sort of the cutoff. So if you score 145 or higher on the practice test, that tells us that you're probably ready. Of course, the higher you get, the more likely you are. We like to see, maybe in the 150s or 160s. But if you get if you pass a practice test at that point, we give you the green light to go ahead and take the final test for the social studies. And it's the same thing once you get through language arts, once you get through science, once through math, it'll be the same process every time.
Okay.
All right.
Are we learning about geography or not?
Yeah, so that'll be part of maps. So when we talk about maps, we'll get into some of the geography aspects. And that's usually how mostly what social studies deals with when it comes to geography. Looking at maps. You don't have to. The only physical geography or political geography that you should probably brush up on is knowing your states, right? Because sometimes they may give you a map. They might not be really clear on the location of states. I actually have a sort of a practice map that I will repost on Google Classroom that I'll post from time to time. So I'll make sure when we talk about maps, I'll put that up. But that's basically the biggest focus will be in regards to geography with maps. All right. Any other questions? Yeah, and you guys, obviously don't sweat it. We still got 2 weeks to work through any issues or anything. So once again, if there's any of those essential ed classes or lessons that you haven't completed yet in social studies, that would be a good time to do them over the next 2 weeks. So if you have any questions about anything, when we get to reviewing, so that, next week, we'll cover the last few things that we need. The week after will be practice test and review. So, think about any questions along the way that you might have. All right. All right. Let's go ahead and take a break then. And of course, if you got any other questions, we can take care of them in language arts. We're going to be doing some more context clue type of work in RLA reading today. So let's go ahead. Let's take a break to about 1:25. I'll shoot out that message on the text thread, and I will see you in language arts. Bye-bye.